Critics of District Attorney Jim Garrison say that it will be more a three-ring circus than a trial at the criminal court building in Orleans Parish. But defenders of Garrison argue that he has a case, and a good one. The issue will be tested in a well-guarded courtroom. No one gets in without special passes. There are seats for 170 spectators. 14 countries will be represented, including the Soviet Union. Even closed-circuit television cameras have been installed for security reasons. One of the two principal actors in the drama is Jim Garrison, the district attorney, a flamboyant man his detractors call the Jolly Green Giant. The other protagonist is Clay Shaw, a retired businessman and real estate dealer. 55 years old, a chain smoker, Shaw has consistently proclaimed his innocence. If he's convicted, he can get 1 to 20 years in jail. A key witness is Perry Russo. He testified at a preliminary hearing that he heard Shaw plotting with Lee Harvey Oswald and a man named David Ferry to kill President Kennedy. The presiding judge is Edward Haggerty. For the next several weeks, the jury will live in a motel a mile from the courthouse. Forbidden newspapers or news programs, allowed only emergency calls home.
On January the 21st, 1969, at the Criminal District Court building in New Orleans, proceedings finally got underway in the case of the State of Louisiana versus Clay L. Shaw. After 14 days of jury selection, the trial proper began on February the 6th, with opening statements from Jim Garrison for the prosecution and from Shaw's lead attorney, Irvin Diamond, for the defence. It was now almost 2 full years since Garrison had turned Shaw's life into a living nightmare by charging him with having conspired to murder President John F. Kennedy. Shaw's trial had been delayed by many different pre-trial motions and appeals, to the point where some of the major players in the case, including Garrison and Diamond, had publicly wondered if there ever would actually be a trial. But finally, the trial was happening. One way or another, history was about to be made. Nobody had ever been criminally prosecuted in association with Kennedy's murder before, and nobody ever would be again. For the first and last time in American history, Kennedy conspiracy theory would be getting its day in court. For assassination buffs, the next 3 weeks of court action were going to be a bit like the Seinfeld finale. All the big names in the assassination drama would be coming down to New Orleans to testify, only instead of Kenny Banya and the Soup Nazi, this trial was going to feature the likes of Marina Oswald, Ruth Payne, Wesley Frazier and Abraham Zapruder, as well as all the colourful New Orleans witnesses who we've come to know in more recent episodes of the podcast, the likes of Dean Andrews, Perry Russo and Vernon Bundy. There would be some surprise new witnesses too, who'd been dug up from under various rocks by Jim Garrison. But although the Shaw trial looked like a circus from many angles, it was certainly not going to be any joke for the defendant. If Clay Shaw wound up being found guilty, he could go to prison for 20 years. For Jim Garrison too, the stakes were going to be high. For almost 2 years now, Garrison had been loudly telling the world that he had solved the Kennedy case. Millions of people around the world had always suspected that there was some kind of conspiracy behind Kennedy's murder, and Garrison had sensationally announced that they were right. The conspiracy was real, and he had proof of it, and he had repeatedly promised that the proof would be delivered when the time came. Well, the time had now finally come. Garrison's chance to put up or shut up had finally arrived, and if he didn't put up, if he failed to deliver on all those big, noisy promises of his, he really was going to look like one of history's all-time greatest frauds and tools. My name is David Free, and this is The Ghosts of Dallas. One reason why Clay Shaw's trial had been delayed for so long was that Shaw and his defence team had actually wanted to delay it, at least initially, because Jim Garrison kept saying grossly prejudicial things about the case on TV and in the newspapers. As Shaw put it himself, as long as Garrison kept shooting off his big fat mouth, Shaw and his attorneys had good reason to delay the trial until the bad publicity had simmered down. But after a while, Shaw and his lawyers realised that there was a flaw in this strategy. Garrison never was going to stop shooting off his mouth. In fact, there was nothing he liked doing more. And all the time he was doing this, Shaw's legal bills kept adding up, and he was fast going broke. Before the trial was done, Shaw would end up burning through all his life savings. The case would end up costing him around $200,000. So even if he avoided going to prison after the verdict, he was certainly going to end up financially ruined, and he was going to have to come out of retirement to pay his bills. One reason the trial cost Shaw so much money was that there was no law of discovery in Louisiana. The prosecution was not under any legal obligation to disclose to the defence any of the evidence that it would be using at the trial, or to name any of the witnesses that it would be putting on the stand. This meant that Shaw and his lawyers had to scramble to cover every single possibility. Every time Garrison called a new press conference to talk vaguely about his latest breakthrough in the case, Shaw's lawyers, at great expense, had to chase down each of these new Garrison brainwaves to find out what the hell he was talking about. You'd think that Shaw's attorneys would have had a distinct advantage over Garrison because his case was false and theirs was true. They were defending an innocent man who had had absolutely nothing to do with Kennedy's murder. But in fact, Shaw's complete innocence ended up putting him and his attorneys on the back foot. As one of Shaw's attorneys explained to a reporter before the trial, the guilty man is easy to defend because you know what he did. We will not know what Clay supposedly did until we hear the witnesses. We anticipate that we will be confronted with one or more surprise witnesses about whom we know nothing and about whom we will know nothing until they walk into the courtroom, take the witness stand, swear to tell the truth, and then proceed to perjure themselves with a story which can only be fictional if it implicates our client. This problem was made worse by the fact that Shaw's opponent, Jim Garrison, had an almost endlessly vivid imagination and no sense of ethics or decency whatsoever. With an opponent like that, there was simply no telling what kind of fantastic new allegations would be made at the trial. It was a given that those allegations would not be true if they implicated Clay Shaw in Kennedy's murder, but it was going to be another thing altogether to prove that they were untrue on the spot in real time. Whether Jim Garrison himself was in any great rush for the trial to start was an interesting question. It seems likely that he wasn't, and that he would have been more than happy for the trial to be put off indefinitely and to let Clay Shaw stay in legal limbo forever. As long as the trial still lay off in the future, Jim Garrison could go on being a national celebrity. He could go on being the man that the world looked at in wonder and listened to in awe, because he alone had the true inside scoop about America's crime of the century. He could keep going on TV and saying things like this.
Well, first of all, Oswald was not part of the plot. Secondly, he did not fire a shot at anyone, not only on that day. He never fired a shot in the preceding year or in the preceding 2 years or since he got out of the Marines, as far as anyone knows. A number of the individuals who accomplished the shooting were previously connected with the Central Intelligence Agency, many of them connected in their training in Florida. And those are some of the individuals whose names we have, and I judge by now they know we have their names. The thing which seemed to have bothered the United States and caused a major world power to participate in such a lowly fraud, such an indescribably low fraud, was the fear that the reputation of the United States or the Central Intelligence Agency would somehow be damaged when it came out that former CIA employees were involved in the assassination and that individuals with control over Oswald, CIA employees, were involved, and that Oswald was working for the CIA. So the United States government participated in one of the greatest lies in history in order to save its face.
Garrison clearly loved being able to go on TV and say things like that. He loved sounding as if he knew all kinds of important secrets which, for legal reasons, he unfortunately couldn't yet divulge. Unfortunately for Garrison, this carefree period of being able to say whatever he liked in public was about to come to an end. When Garrison went off his meds and charged Clay Shaw with the very serious crime of conspiracy, Shaw wasn't the only one who'd been dropped in the shit. Garrison had inadvertently dropped himself in the shit too. From the moment he made that drastic move, it was only a matter of time before he would have to litigate the case for real in front of a judge instead of Johnny Carson. Garrison was going to have to walk into a courtroom and explain to a jury exactly how the mild-mannered businessman Clay Shaw, of all people, had masterminded the murder of President Kennedy. When the trial started, the world would finally get to see whether Jim Garrison was serious or not. The first big telltale sign that he wasn't serious came behind closed doors in the DA's office, not long before the trial began. Garrison called all his staff together and he made a big announcement. He told them that he was not going to be handling the prosecution himself. He was going to delegate that job to his deputy DA, James Alcock. This announcement came as a huge surprise to everybody in the office, especially Alcock, because up until now, Garrison had made a big deal out of being the only guy in the office who knew all the details of the Shaw conspiracy. He'd handled the case inside his office in the same secretive way that he'd handled it in the outside world. He'd told his staffers that they didn't need to know about the entirety of the case against Clay Shaw. They only had to know about the specific little area of it that they'd each been assigned to. As one staffer put it, Garrison had constructed a Chinese wall between himself and everybody else in the office. And this meant that his staff was almost as much in the dark about Garrison's overall case as the rest of the world was. Like everyone else in the world, they assumed that Garrison must have something big against Shaw and that he would be pulling it out of his sleeve when the time came. And, like everybody else, they had no idea what that big something was going to be. When Garrison broke the news to James Alcock that he would be running the trial, Alcock said to Garrison, "Okay, so now it's probably time that you told me about all the other evidence that you haven't told me about yet." And Garrison replied, "You already know all of it. That's all there is to know. That's it." James Alcock is said to have been shattered by this revelation. Patricia Lambert says in her book False Witness that on the night before the Shaw trial began, Alcock went to the home of another assistant DA and broke down in tears. He said that he didn't know what to do. He said that he was being forced to prosecute an innocent man. If you've seen the movie JFK, you'll probably have memories of Kevin Costner as Jim Garrison striding manfully into the courtroom as the Shaw trial begins and masterfully running the prosecution case. Costner is there in court the whole time, putting himself about, nervously chewing his glasses when things go wrong, shouting into the judge's face every time he gets shafted by some outrageous ruling. But at the real-life Shaw trial, the real-life Jim Garrison not only didn't run the state's case, he barely even bothered to show up in court. The trial ran for 3 weeks, and Garrison averaged only 1 day a week in the courtroom. He examined only a few of the state's witnesses, and when Clay Shaw himself got up on the stand to testify in his own defence, Garrison, unbelievably, decided that he was not going to handle the state's cross-examination of Shaw personally. Instead, he left the job to James Alcock again. Garrison had spent the last 2 years very publicly manoeuvring Clay Shaw into the dock, and now that he'd finally got him there, Garrison mysteriously found that he had better things to do than cross-examine the man himself. Indeed, Garrison didn't even bother to turn up in court to listen to Shaw's testimony. All this behaviour was incredibly strange, coming from a man who claimed to believe that he'd caught one of the elusive conspirators that the whole world had been looking for the past 2 years. A conspirator who was responsible for the public, cold-blooded murder of the most powerful man on the planet. Garrison made only 2 significant in-person contributions during the course of the trial. He delivered the state's opening statement on day 1, and he delivered its closing statement on the final day. This tends to confirm one's impression that what Garrison was really interested in was making speeches. He liked to bloviate about big abstract themes like power and justice, but he seemed to think that he was a little bit above engaging with stuff like evidence and facts, the stuff that he once called the mere detail. When Garrison made his opening statement, though, there was one pesky little legal detail that he did have to engage with. Under Louisiana law, to prove that Clay Shaw was guilty of conspiracy, the state had to do more than just prove that Shaw and his fellow conspirators had made a verbal agreement to kill Kennedy. The state also had to prove that one or more of those conspirators had performed a, quote, overt act in furtherance of the agreement. In other words, the state had to prove that Shaw and his fellow conspirators hadn't just said stuff, they'd also done stuff. In his opening statement, Garrison promised the jury that the state would prove that 5 overt acts had been performed in connection with Clay Shaw's Kennedy conspiracy. The state will prove the following overt acts, Garrison said. The first overt act of the conspiracy was the meeting in David Ferry's apartment between Shaw, Ferry and Oswald. Another overt act was a trip that Clay Shaw had made to the West Coast on the day of the assassination, supposedly to give himself an alibi. The 5th and final overt act of the conspiracy, Garrison told the jury, was, quote, Lee Harvey Oswald taking a rifle to the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas, Texas, on or before November the 22nd, 1963. This part of Garrison's opening statement would have come as a rude shock to anyone who'd been paying attention to his many public pronouncements about the assassination. Over the course of the last 2 years, Garrison had repeatedly told the press and the public that Lee Harvey Oswald had had nothing to do with Kennedy's murder, and that he was a totally innocent man. We've already heard Garrison riffing on this theme once during this episode. Here he is riffing on it again in 1967, more than a year before the trial.
It appears likely that there was shooting from the book depository, although it is obvious that Lee Oswald had nothing to do with it. He didn't shoot any weapons that day, and there's no indication that he was in any way involved in the assassination. As a matter of fact, the indication is quite the opposite.
When Garrison went around making public statements like that about Oswald's complete innocence, he made himself a hero to the Kennedy conspiracy community. As we saw in some of the very first episodes of this podcast, most of the early conspiracy theorists in the Kennedy case were left-wing thinkers. Some of them, like Sylvia Meagher and Harold Weisberg, had even been harassed for their left-wing views during the Red Scares. When Kennedy was shot, people like Meagher and Weisberg instantly embraced the idea of conspiracy because they refused to believe that a self-identified Marxist like Oswald could have had any possible reason to murder a liberal president like Kennedy. their instincts told them that Kennedy had been murdered by right-wingers, and that the left-wing Oswald was the victim of a vast right-wing conspiracy. It was like the Red Scares all over again. Oswald had been framed, and the framing of Oswald was more than just the framing of one man. It was a framing of the American left in general. It's important to note that left-wing conspiracy theorists of this kind didn't just believe in conspiracy for the sake of believing in conspiracy. They didn't just believe in any old conspiracy. They believed in a very particular kind of conspiracy, a conspiracy in which Oswald had been completely uninvolved, except in his capacity as a completely innocent fall guy. For these people, there was no mileage in believing in any kind of smaller scale conspiracy involving a guilty Oswald and a couple of accomplices, because if Oswald had consciously participated in any kind of conspiracy, it would have been a conspiracy of left-wingers. And for the American left, the idea that Kennedy had been murdered by a conspiracy of left-wingers was even less acceptable than the idea that he'd been murdered by a lone left-winger. For these left-leaning conspiracy theorists, the idea of Oswald's innocence was like a kind of religious fetish. It was an article of faith. And when Jim Garrison came along and started saying in public that Oswald was indeed innocent, and when he kind of implied that he would be producing evidence to prove that in court, Garrison was tapping into a belief that had energized Kennedy conspiracy theory from the very beginning. And some people in the movement were very excited and started treating him like he was a kind of messiah. But there were smarter members of the Kennedy conspiracy community who immediately understood that Garrison was speaking with a forked tongue on the Oswald issue. As we saw in the previous episode of the podcast, Sylvia Meagher was the first prominent conspiracy theorist who publicly broke with Jim Garrison, and the thing she broke with him about was the issue of Oswald's innocence. Some of her friends, like Harold Weisberg, tried to assure Meagher that she had nothing to worry about. They told her that Garrison believed that Oswald was innocent too, just like they did. But Sylvia Meagher was smart enough to see that this was bullshit. No matter what Garrison said about Oswald in public, his case against Clay Shaw was clearly premised on the assumption that Oswald was guilty. From the moment this became clear to Meagher, she decided that she was not going to have a bar of what Jim Garrison was doing. As she wrote to one of her friends, "I will not be a party to incriminating Oswald in the assassination on the lies and fabrications of the Warren Commission or on the lies and fabrications of Garrison, and I intend to speak out against both of them and against their supporters and collaborators." In retrospect, it's hard to see why Sylvia Meagher had such a hard time making her friends see that Garrison's case against Clay Shaw simply didn't make sense without the assumption of a guilty Oswald. It was a glaringly obvious fact. In fact, it was right there in the bill of indictment, which charged that Clay Shaw had, quote, willfully and unlawfully conspired with David W. Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, and others to murder John F. Kennedy. It didn't take any special kind of genius to work out that if Clay Shaw was guilty because he had conspired with Oswald, that meant that Oswald was guilty too. And while we're talking about the indictment, I should quickly say that at the trial, Garrison never did end up revealing the identity of the mysterious others who were mentioned in the indictment. The others fell by the wayside, and during the trial, the only conspirators the prosecution mentioned by name were Oswald, Shaw, and Ferry. And there was no mention of the CIA either, despite the incredible song and dance that Garrison made about the CIA before the trial and after the trial. When the trial actually happened, the prosecution did not mention the CIA even once. At this point, you're probably asking yourself what on earth Garrison was thinking when he went around before the trial repeatedly saying that Oswald was innocent. what did he have to gain from doing that, given that he had named Oswald as a conspirator in the indictment, and given that he intended to name him as a conspirator during the trial? Surely it was a bad idea for Garrison to go around between the indictment and the trial telling anybody who would listen to him that Oswald was completely innocent and had nothing to do with the conspiracy. The question of why Garrison did this cries out for an answer, but as usual with Garrison, it's not all that easy to say for sure what the answer was. You can't explain his behaviour by saying that he was a cynic and an opportunist who would say anything to help his own case, because when he went around saying that Oswald was innocent, Garrison wasn't helping his own case. He was hurting it. He was actively undermining one of the central arguments that he was going to need to use at Shaw's trial. It was perverse of Garrison to contradict himself in this way, or at least it would have been perverse if he'd realised that that was what he was doing. But I'm not sure that he did realise that. As we know, Garrison was a man who had a genuinely hard time thinking straight about reality, and nowhere was his confusion about the world more apparent than in his lifelong chronic inability to make up his mind about Lee Harvey Oswald. Somehow he just didn't seem to grasp that it was illogical to believe that Oswald had been innocent and guilty at the same time, and that basic sanity demands that you have to pick one of those positions and stick to it, particularly if you presume to know so much about Kennedy's assassination that you're willing to put a man in prison for 20 years on the basis of your views. Garrison's position on Oswald wasn't just incoherent and inconsistent and illogical. It was also, as I've said, downright self-defeating. Garrison didn't seem to get this, but there were smarter people in his office who did. After Garrison made one of his many public statements about Oswald's innocence, James Alcock privately said to one of his colleagues that Garrison had just, quote, pulled our overt act out from underneath us. When Garrison made his opening statement at the trial, though, he made an effort to put the rug of Oswald's guilt back under his own feet. He told the jury that Oswald had carried a rifle into the book depository on the morning of the assassination, and that this act was performed as part of the plan that he had concocted with Clay Shaw and David Ferry at Ferry's apartment. Garrison told the jury, quote, "The plan brought forth was that the president would be killed with a triangulation of crossfire with at least 2 gunmen, but preferably 3, shooting at the same time. The evidence will show that President Kennedy was struck in the front as well as the back, and that the final shot which struck him came from in front of him, knocking him backwards in the car." Once again, Garrison went on, "Since Lee Oswald was in the book depository behind the president, this will show that a number of men were shooting and that he was therefore killed as the result of a conspiracy." So, according to Garrison's opening statement, Oswald did a lot more than just carry a rifle into the building that day. He was one of the, quote, number of men who had shot at Kennedy, and one of the shots fired by Oswald was one of the shots that hit him. Garrison was sailing dangerously close to the wind of reality when he said that. The one belief that unites all Kennedy conspiracy theorists is that there's somehow something problematic or not quite straightforward about Oswald's guilt, as if his guilt has somehow never been proved, or as if it somehow isn't enough in itself to explain the crime. But when you look at the evidence, you find that this is, of course, an absolute fantasy. Oswald was as guilty as sin. And here was Jim Garrison, of all people, finally seeming to accept the evidence on that point. He was starting to sound dangerously conventional. He was agreeing with a central claim of the dreaded official story, as told by the evil Warren Commission. And if you agree with the evidence against Oswald to that extent, it's hard to see why you shouldn't go all the way and accept all the evidence against him. But whenever Jim Garrison veered too close to a reality that he didn't like, he was always able to invent a little hack or patch to get himself out of trouble. This is the beauty of making things up as you go along. When reality starts breathing down your neck too heavily, you can simply invent an imaginary bridge that will take you back into the world of fantasy. You may remember that in the previous episode of the podcast, I quoted an apparently mysterious public statement that Garrison made once about Oswald. He said that Oswald had been, quote, a participant, decoy, and patsy. I said at the time that this sounded like a strange claim because how on earth can somebody be both a participant and a patsy at the same time? But when Garrison made his opening statement at the trial, he finally explained how this claim of his made sense, or at least made sense inside his head. He told the jury that when Shaw and Oswald and Ferry were first brainstorming the assassination of Kennedy at Ferry's apartment, one of them had made an interesting suggestion. To quote Garrison, one of the gunmen, it was indicated, might have to be sacrificed as a scapegoat or patsy to allow the other participants time to make their escape. No one indicated to Oswald at the meeting that he was going to be the scapegoat or patsy, and there was no indication of any awareness on his part of such an eventuality. So in the world of Garrison's imagination, that's how Oswald had ended up taking the fall for Kennedy's murder. He'd started off being one of the three chief architects of that murder, and he'd agreed at the initial planning session that it would be an excellent idea to pin the crime on a scapegoat or patsy, but unfortunately he'd forgotten to say, by the way, I bags not being that patsy myself. So Shaw and Ferry had subsequently decided to double-cross Oswald and pin the crime on him, even though he'd participated in the planning of the crime from day one and could quite easily have spilled his guts about the whole conspiracy as soon as he realised that Shaw and Ferry had fucked him. It would have been far more orthodox for them to pick a scapegoat or patsy who knew less about the crime, or preferably even nothing about it. For example, they could have pinned it on one of the nameless gunmen who Garrison believed had shot Kennedy from the grassy knoll. When you think about it, it does sort of defeat the purpose of pinning a crime on a patsy if you pin it on a patsy who actually did commit the crime and indeed helped to mastermind it. To put it another way, Jim Garrison had invented a concept that was previously unknown to man, the concept of the guilty patsy. Again, it's hard to know exactly what was going on in Garrison's head when he did this, but my guess is that he knew that it was very trendy to believe that Oswald was just a patsy, and he wanted to give people the impression that he was on board with that idea. And perhaps at some level he believed that he really was on board with it because, as we know, Garrison was not all that big on the importance of logical consistency. There was always a tension in Garrison between Garrison the DA and Garrison the conspiratorial dreamer. One part of him wanted to live in a world of pure conspiratorial fantasy, and the other part of him had to meet reality halfway and produce evidence for those fantasies in a court of law. In the world of pure fantasy, Oswald was innocent and Shaw was guilty. In the world of reality, it was the other way around. Shaw was innocent and Oswald was guilty. At the Shaw trial, Jim Garrison split the difference. To prove Shaw's imaginary guilt, Garrison ditched his imaginary belief in Oswald's innocence and suddenly decided to acknowledge the huge body of very real evidence that proved Oswald's guilt. In the indictment and in court, Garrison piggybacked on the real evidence. He charged that Shaw was guilty because he'd been seen rubbing shoulders with Oswald, who was the man who obviously had shot the president. When Garrison acknowledged Oswald's guilt, he was putting one foot into the world of documented fact, the world of what had actually happened. But he kept his other foot planted in the world of pure conspiratorial fantasy. And in that world, Shaw was a conspirator and Oswald was a patsy. The concept of the guilty patsy encapsulated Garrison's one foot in each world approach. It was like a double adapter that connected those two worlds. On one side, Garrison could plug in all the solid and real evidence which showed that Oswald was guilty. And the other cord in the adapter led off to a world that existed only in Garrison's head, a world in which Oswald met with Clay Shaw and David Ferry at Ferry's apartment to plan Kennedy's murder. Since Garrison had simply imagined that meeting, he was perfectly free to imagine a second follow-up meeting between just Shaw and Ferry, where they agreed that Oswald was going to be the patsy. Ever since the first episode of this podcast, I've tried to hammer the fairly obvious point that any sane discussion about who killed Kennedy has to begin with Oswald. Personally, I think that the conversation ends with Oswald as well, but I'm well aware that there are a lot of people who disagree with me on that point, and I think it's always possible to have a sensible, evidence-based discussion about the case with anybody who can give you a straight answer to a simple question. Did Oswald fire all the shots, some of the shots, or none of the shots? It's the most basic question in the case. One of those three things must have happened that day, and only one of them. It's either A, B, or C. I think the answer is A, Oswald fired all the shots, but B and C are at least coherent positions which can be defended more or less rationally. But if somebody can't give you a straight answer to that simple question, I think you should back away from them very slowly, because I think it's a clear sign that they haven't thought in an even vaguely serious way about the evidence. Unfortunately, the world couldn't walk away from Jim Garrison, and Clay Shaw certainly couldn't walk away from him. But the fact is that even though Garrison liked to portray himself as the world's greatest single authority on the assassination, he simply never managed to make up his mind about the most basic question in the whole case. Before the trial, he said that Oswald had fired none of the shots. At the trial, he said that Oswald had fired some of the shots. And then after the trial, he went back to saying that Oswald had fired none of the shots. If Garrison didn't even have a firm and consistent view about this basic entry-level question, then what on earth was he doing wasting his own time and everybody else's, carrying on as if he was the only person in the world who knew the hidden truth about the assassination? To prove my point that Garrison was most at home in the world of pure fantasy and only entered the world of reality when he absolutely had to, it's worth jumping ahead for a moment to the year 1988, when Garrison published his book On the Trail of the Assassins. In 1988, the Shaw trial was a distant memory, and Garrison was long past the point where he needed to worry about whether his claims about the Kennedy case would even vaguely stand up in court. In his book, Garrison celebrated that freedom by taking a final position on Oswald that was just completely and bizarrely at odds with reality. In the book, Garrison doesn't just claim that Oswald was thoroughly innocent. He claims that he, Garrison, worked out that Oswald was innocent before the trial and argued that he was innocent at the trial. This was jaw-droppingly untrue, and Garrison was spitting in the face of the historical record when he said it. And yet, as always, he managed to sound serenely sure of himself as he talked a blue streak of bollocks. Here's what he said in the book, quote, "After going over the government's own evidence, I realised that my earlier conclusion that Oswald had not been the lone killer of President Kennedy was not entirely correct. Clearly there had been others involved in the shooting, but the truth was that Lee Harvey Oswald himself had not shot John Kennedy at all, nor had he even attempted to shoot John Kennedy. It seemed inescapable to me as a professional prosecutor that the man damned by the world as the criminal of the century was innocent. only the truly innocent have to be as thoroughly set up as Lee Oswald obviously had been. In the Shaw trial to come, I knew that if I could convince a jury that Oswald was incapable of murdering John Kennedy or J.D. Tippit, this would improve our chances for a conviction immensely. It would immediately force the jury to consider the possibility of a conspiracy as a realistic alternative to the Warren Commission scenario." End quote. This is beyond being just untrue. It's so clearly and provably untrue that it's downright creepy that Garrison was prepared to say it publicly in a book that was supposed to be a work of non-fiction. Patricia Lambert, in her book False Witness, says that she had a kind of epiphany about Garrison when she read this passage in his book. She says that she realised that, quote, "Nothing he wrote can be trusted, not even A and the. He treated all events, however verifiable, as mutable and subject to his revision. When I realised that, I was astonished, first by the fact of it, then the audacity. I found it baffling and scary. Baffling that Garrison imagined he could get away with it. Scary that, so far, he has succeeded spectacularly." The key observation from Lambert in that passage is that Garrison was ready to rewrite the facts of history, even when those facts could very easily be checked and verified. Garrison's claim that he had tried to convince the Shaw jury that Oswald was innocent is very easy to fact-check, and when you do fact-check it, you find that it's 100% false. And if this is how cavalier Garrison could be when he was dealing with facts that could easily be checked up on, you can only imagine how cavalier he was when he was making claims that were harder to fact-check or not possible to fact-check at all. The same point applies across the board to all conspiratorial writers and thinkers. I've spent many years now reading the literature of the Kennedy conspiracists, and one of the depressing things that you find after reading these people for a while is that everything they say, literally everything, has to be double-checked, because when you do double-check it, it always turns out to be off the mark in some way. Sometimes it's blatantly off the mark. Sometimes it's off the mark in very subtle ways that take quite a long time to explain. Conspiracy theorists have a chronic inability to present evidence clearly and fairly and accurately. Most of them aren't being consciously deceptive when they do this. They just don't have a proper respect for the weight of evidence. For the worst of the conspiracy theorists, though, the people like Jim Garrison, reality is just an infinitely malleable plaything, like a piece of Play-Doh, which they can reshape at will to conform with their fantasies. But although Garrison was free to be a pure conspiracy theorist in his book, he was less free to be one at the trial. At the trial, he couldn't present an argument that was entirely made out of Play-Doh. He had to acknowledge the evidence in some way and to some extent. That's what he did when he acknowledged that Oswald carried a rifle into the book depository and fired one of the shots that hit Kennedy. Garrison used that solid and provable chunk of historical reality as a kind of foundation, and he slapped the Play-Doh scenario of Shaw's guilt on top of that, and then remoulded and reshaped that Play-Doh scenario around the hard facts. But Oswald's guilt is a very dangerous truth for a conspiracy theorist to flirt with. Once you've dipped one foot into the possibility of Oswald's guilt, it can easily suck you in all the way, like a tractor beam or a pit full of quicksand. That's why most Kennedy conspiracy theorists prefer to avert their gaze from the Oswald tractor beam as quickly as they possibly can. They get Oswald out of the way in about 5 seconds by telling you that it's simply preposterous to believe that a lone nut with a $20 rifle could have single-handedly murdered the President of the United States, and then they briskly move on to the subject of the CIA or the Mafia or the military-industrial complex. But Garrison had dipped his toe into the quicksand by admitting that Oswald did carry a rifle into the Texas schoolbook depository on the morning of the assassination and used that rifle to fire one of the shots that hit Kennedy. And if you're ready to admit that, then why not admit that it was possible that he fired a second shot while he was at it? And if he fired a second shot, you're just one shot away from going the full Monty and admitting that maybe he fired all the shots. As soon as you acknowledge that Oswald was in the picture to some extent, you put yourself on a slippery slope and you realise very quickly that you don't need the superfluous idea of conspiracy. You don't need to give Oswald any Play-Doh accomplices or sidekicks. He was more than capable of doing the whole thing by himself. But of course, the superfluous idea of conspiracy was what Jim Garrison was all about. That's why the trial of Clay Shaw was happening in the first place. That's why everybody was here. Garrison had to believe, or at least had to argue, that Oswald had had at least one imaginary sidekick, namely the defendant, Clay Shaw. And Garrison didn't just have to argue that, he had to prove it, which meant that he had to dig up from somewhere a bunch of different witnesses who would testify to Shaw's guilt. The quality of those witnesses was going to tell the jury and the world how credible Garrison's conspiratorial beliefs were. And we already know about the quality of the witnesses that Garrison produced at Shaw's pre-trial hearing. He produced the chronic liar Perry Russo, who had to be hypnotised and pumped full of truth serum before he finally remembered that he'd ever even met Clay Shaw. And Garrison also produced the heroin addict Vernon Bundy, who told a truly preposterous story about seeing Shaw meet Oswald beside a lake while Bundy was geezing up on the adjacent seawall. This sorry pair of obvious liars, Russo and Bundy, had been Garrison's only witnesses against Shaw at the preliminary hearing, and both of them would be making a return appearance at the trial. But Garrison's office had dug up some fresh witnesses as well. On day one of the trial, James Alcock called 8 different witnesses to the stand who had never been heard from before in the case. The prosecution was excited by the story that these new witnesses had to tell because it put Oswald, Shaw and Ferry together in a brand new scenario, a scenario that had never been heard about before. It's going to all be over on the first day, one of Garrison's deputies had confidently predicted. From the defence point of view, these new witnesses were exactly the kind of surprise witnesses that they'd been dreading. The story that these witnesses told was a completely new one on the defence, and somehow the defence would have to find a way of punching some holes in this story on the spot, in real time. According to 4 of these new witnesses, one day in August or September of 1963, a black Cadillac had pulled up in the main street of a small town in Louisiana called Clinton. There were 3 men in this car, or possibly 4. The witnesses didn't agree about all of the story's details, but there was general agreement among them that the driver of the black Cadillac was Clay Shaw, and that 2 of the men with him were Oswald and Ferry. There was a voter registration drive happening that day in Clinton, and Oswald was apparently keen on registering to vote. So he got out of the car and lined up in the registration queue, and he waited for about 3 hours to get to the front. Meanwhile, Clay Shaw and David Ferry, who had apparently just come along for the hang, waited around in town until Oswald was finished. Together, the witnesses who testified to this story were known as the Clinton witnesses, because Clinton was the small country town where this odd little scene had supposedly taken place. The testimony of the Clinton witnesses would end up being the most effective part of the prosecution's whole case. One member of the jury was so impressed by it that he initially marked his ballot guilty because of this evidence. And after the trial was done, the Clinton story would wind up having a very long half-life in the world of Kennedy conspiracism. long after all the other so-called evidence against Clay Shaw had melted away into nothingness, the Clinton story lingered in the atmosphere. In the movie JFK, the Clinton episode is portrayed as if it actually happened. There are black and white flashback scenes in which Gary Oldman as Oswald and Tommy Lee Jones as Shaw roll up in this dusty little town and generally make a spectacle of themselves. It wasn't until the year 2000, more than 30 years after the Shaw trial, that the Clinton story was finally and conclusively debunked. The story of how it was debunked is very interesting, but it's also quite long and involved, and I'm going to leave that story aside for the moment and go on telling the story of the trial. One of the challenges that face you when you're dealing with the Kennedy murder is that conspiracy theory always wants to stop you from moving forward. It always wants to drag you sideways into the weeds so that you can spend the rest of your life inspecting each individual weed to see if it really is a weed or if it actually might hold the key to the whole thing. We'll come back to this particular weed later on, but for the moment I want to stay on the fairway and keep heading towards the green. I don't want to talk too much about an incident that didn't happen until I've finished telling the story of what did happen. For the moment, the main thing we need to know about the Clinton episode is that although it later turned out not to have happened at all, the story that the Clinton witnesses told at the trial was quite compelling, and it made an impression on the jury, and Shaw's lawyers were unable to put any dents in that story on the spot. They knew that the Clinton witnesses had to be wrong in some fundamental way, but in the heat of battle, they just couldn't work out how to prove that. Not all of the state's witnesses were as compelling as the Clinton witnesses, though. The standard certainly dropped when Perry Russo got on the stand. In a way, it was amazing that Garrison's office was still prepared to use Russo as a witness. He'd been Garrison's original star witness against Shaw, and for a long time he'd been his only witness, but the shine had gone off Perry Russo a long time ago. The story that he told at Shaw's preliminary hearing, the story of how he'd seen Shaw, Oswald and Ferry plotting Kennedy's murder in Ferry's apartment, that story had been torpedoed from many different angles since then. In May 1967, the journalist James Phelan had discovered that when Russo was first interviewed by Garrison's office, he said nothing about Oswald or about any meeting in Ferry's apartment. He said that he'd never met Clay Shaw and had only ever seen him twice from a distance. Only when Russo was hypnotised and asked some grossly leading questions by the hypnotist did he suddenly recall the scene that he had supposedly witnessed at Ferry's apartment. About a month after James Phelan published those revelations, Russo himself admitted to a reporter from NBC that his testimony at the preliminary hearing had been, quote, a combination of truth, fantasy and lies. He also told the reporter that he was afraid to change his story and tell the truth because he knew that Garrison would charge him with perjury if he did that. Russo's exact quote to the NBC reporter was, "The hell with truth, the hell with justice. You're asking me to sacrifice myself for Clay Shaw, and I won't do it." After all of that, Garrison should have been ashamed to put Perry Russo back on the stand at Clay Shaw's trial, but of course he did, because he was so hard up for witnesses that he had to. This time around, Russo told a noticeably watered-down version of his original story. He seemed to be soft-peddling his allegations against Clay Shaw now, almost as if he was trying to undo the damage that he'd done to him in the past. He still maintained that one night in Ferry's apartment he'd heard Shaw, Oswald and Ferry discussing the murder of the president, but he didn't seem all that sure now that what he'd seen qualified as a real conspiracy. "I don't call them conspirators," he testified. "I have never used that word." On cross-examination, Russo admitted that the conversation that he'd supposedly witnessed might not really have been all that serious. It was possible, he said, that the three men were, quote, just shooting the bull. He also admitted that he never actually heard either Oswald or Shaw agree to kill the president. All that he'd heard was David Ferry saying, "We will kill him," which was something that Ferry had often said in the past. Of course, these apparent concessions of Perry Russo's were still lies. He was still talking about a meeting that had never really happened, so it was kind of a moot point whether the men at this imaginary meeting were serious or just shooting the bull. Perry Russo was the one who was shooting the bull. Even so, it was telling that he had suddenly decided to water down his bullshit story about Clay Shaw now that Shaw was standing trial. Garrison's other star witness from the preliminary hearing, the heroin addict Vernon Bundy, also made a return appearance at the trial. He told the same story that he'd told the first time, which was that one fine day in 1963, he had decided to head out to the sea wall at Lake Pontchartrain so that he could kick back in the open air for a bit of al fresco heroin injecting. As Bundy cooked up his fix on the sea wall, he witnessed a meeting between two men who he identified as Oswald and Shaw. He saw Shaw give Oswald a roll of money, and when Oswald put the money in his pocket, a pamphlet fluttered out of his pocket and fell on the ground, and there was something written on the pamphlet like, "Hands off Cuba." Bundy knew what was written on the pamphlet because after Shaw and Oswald had gone away, he went over, picked the pamphlet up, and used it to wrap up his heroin rig in. When Bundy had told this preposterous story the first time at the preliminary hearing, Clay Shaw wrote in his diary that Garrison's decision to put Bundy on the stand seemed to be, quote, almost a contemptuous gesture toward the judges. This time round, the contemptuous gesture was being made toward the jury. And Bundy's story was even more ludicrous this time than it had been the first time, because this time he added the detail that Clay Shaw had struck him as looking a bit like a narcotics officer. Shaw's lawyer, Irvin Diamond, found this revelation interesting. He asked Bundy why, if Clay Shaw looked to him as if he might be a narcotics agent, he had still gone ahead and shot up in the open air, more or less right in front of him. And Bundy's reply was that he had just had an urge to, quote, goof off. Bundy's testimony was pretty embarrassing stuff, but it was far from being the low point of the state's case. That low point came when James Alcock called a man to the stand by the name of Charles Speisel. Speisel was an accountant from New York, and he was another new witness in the case. When he got up on the stand, nobody except the prosecution had any idea who he was or what he was about to say. To start with, Speisel's testimony seemed to be going fairly well for the state, but before he was done, Speisel went badly sideways for the prosecution. Indeed, he was such a disaster that even Jim Garrison, the master fantasist, couldn't bring himself to pretend that he hadn't been. In his book, Garrison called Speisel the bomb that shattered our case. The bomb didn't go off immediately, though. When James Alcock examined Speisel for the state, he came across as a fairly lucid and credible witness. The story he told was that one night in June 1963, he'd been visiting New Orleans when he saw David Ferry in a bar. According to Speisel, he recognised Ferry because he'd flown with him in the Air Force during World War II. This was the first fishy thing about Speisel's story because David Ferry had never served in the Air Force. But in any case, Speisel said that he had, and that he and Ferry had hung around in the bar for a while, catching up, before Ferry then took him on to a party in an apartment somewhere in the French Quarter. The host of this party was none other than Clay Shaw. Speisel testified that when he and Ferry arrived at Shaw's party, 10 or 11 other men were already present there, and that at a certain point in the evening, the men all started talking about how much they disliked President Kennedy. "Someone ought to kill the son of a bee," one of the men said. Everybody else seemed to like this idea, so the discussion then turned to the logistics of how the deed could be done. Somebody mentioned the idea of shooting Kennedy with a high-powered rifle. At this point, another guy chimed in. He was a scruffy-looking guy who for some reason had a splint on his finger. This guy said that as soon as the splint was off his finger, he would be more than happy to act as the gunman. The discussion then turned to the question of how the scruffy-looking gunman could get away after he'd done the deed, at which point Clay Shaw suggested that David Ferry could perhaps use his light plane as a getaway vehicle. As Speisel unfolded this story on the stand, Shaw's lawyers had their usual problem. They knew that the story couldn't possibly be true, but it wasn't clear to them how they could punch any holes through it on the spot. But as Speisel was testifying, a court deputy came over to the defence table and he had a message for one of Shaw's attorneys, a guy named Sal Panzeca. Apparently Panzeca's next-door neighbour had telephoned the courthouse trying to get in touch with him. Panzeca's first reaction was to blow the call off because Speisel's testimony was important and he didn't want to miss any of it. But the court deputy kept coming back over to the table, telling Panzeca that his neighbour had called back. So finally Panzeca left the courtroom to go and take the call. It was a good thing that he did, because it turned out that Panzeca's neighbour had some crucial information to offer about Charles Speisel. The neighbour happened to know Speisel because he'd worked with him at an accountancy firm, and he'd heard on the radio that Speisel was testifying at the trial, and he thought that Panzeca might like to know that Speisel was well known to be certifiably insane. He was paranoid. He heard voices. In 1964, he had sued the city of New York for $16 million because he believed that the city was actively participating in a vast communist plot to ruin him. Speisel had acted as his own lawyer during that proceeding, which is not always a good sign. His lawsuit alleged that the city of New York had for many years been controlling Speisel's thoughts through hypnosis, with the aim of destroying his business and fucking up his sex life. Speisel believed, among other things, that the city authorities had abducted his real parents and had replaced them with a couple of well-disguised imposters. As for his story about Clay Shaw, it turned out that Charles Speisel had been shopping this story around for a while. He'd tried to sell it to CBS TV for $2,000, but the network had blown him off. When he had reached out to Jim Garrison's office, though, Speisel discovered that Garrison's standards were a lot lower than CBS's. Garrison liked the sound of Speisel's story, and he immediately sent a couple of his deputies up to New York to interview him. Their interview didn't go all that well, though, because it was clear to them that Speisel was a seriously disturbed man. Among other things, he told Garrison's deputies that he was in the habit of fingerprinting his children each night and in the morning so that he could be sure that the federal government hadn't replaced them with some dead-ringer secret agents during the night. When Garrison's deputies came back to New York, they warned Garrison against putting Speisel on the stand. "He would make a great witness," one of them said, "but he's crazy." Unbelievably, though, Garrison decided that he was going to put Speisel on the stand anyway. He figured that Speisel came across as a fairly normal guy with a family and a steady job. You couldn't tell that Speisel was a nut just by looking at him, and Garrison thought that it was very unlikely that the defence would suddenly decide to ask him when he was on the stand if he was in the habit of fingerprinting his own children. But thanks to the phone call that Sal Panzeca got from his neighbour, the defence found out in the nick of time that that was exactly the sort of question that they should ask him. When Irvin Diamond started to cross-examine Speisel, He asked him if it was true that he'd once launched a lawsuit against the city of New York. Spiesel said yes, and happily proceeded to tell Diamond all about the vast New York conspiracy against him. When Diamond asked Spiesel how he'd landed on the figure of $16 million when he was deciding how much to sue the city for, Spiesel replied, well, it's $1 million for each year of the conspiracy. Diamond also got Spiesel to open up on the topic of mind control. How many different people have hypnotised you? He asked him. And Spiesel replied, it's hard to say, possibly 50 or 60. All of these without consent? Diamond asked him, and Spiesel said, yes, without my consent. Did it ever happen in New Orleans? Diamond asked him, and Spiesel replied, I believe I've been followed down here by people from the detective agencies. I asked you if you had been hypnotised in New Orleans, Diamond said, and Spiesel replied, from time to time, someone has tried to hypnotise me. Apparently Spiesel's demeanour on the stand was quite cheerful as he said all this, because after all it was all true, according to him. But to everybody else in the room, the implications of Spiesel's testimony were clear. The sky fell in, was how James Alcock put it later. The headline in the next day's New York Times said, surprise witness says he's victim of red plot. Jim Garrison later tried to distance himself from the Spiesel fiasco. He said in his book that it had been James Alcock's decision to put Spiesel on the stand. That was outrageously untrue, though. In fact, Alcock was one of the deputy DAs who had gone to New York to interview Spiesel and who had come back and explicitly warned Garrison against using him. Alcock was the one who'd said to Garrison he would make a great witness, but he's crazy. And it was Garrison who had decided to put him on the stand anyway. In his book, On the Trail of the Assassins, Garrison pretends that Spiesel's mental health issues came as a complete surprise to him when the defence exposed them on the stand. Garrison writes, for one very long moment, while I am sure that my face revealed no concern, I was swept by a feeling of nausea. The way Garrison spins it in his book, he felt nauseated not because his own decision to put Spiesel on the stand had blown up in his face, but because it was suddenly dawning on him that Spiesel was some kind of government agent or plant. The same people who had killed Kennedy had now evidently sabotaged Garrison's case by somehow forcing him to put a deranged witness on the stand. To quote Garrison again, on cross-examination, the Chief Defence Counsel uncannily seemed to know just what questions to ask Spiesel. I realised that the clandestine operation of the opposition was so cynical, so sophisticated, and at the same time so subtle, that destroying an old-fashioned state jury trial was very much like shooting a fish in a barrel with a shotgun. The idea that Charles Spiesel had been planted by the government to destroy Garrison's case was at least as insane as anything that Spiesel said on the stand himself, but at least Spiesel had the excuse of being legitimately deranged. Garrison didn't have that excuse. I know that I've said many times in this podcast that there was a clear element of insanity in Garrison's prosecution of Shaw. Indeed, I've quoted people who knew Garrison personally saying in so many words that he was nuts or paranoid or crazy. But when you compare Garrison with an authentically unwell person like Spiesel, you do suddenly realise that Garrison wasn't that crazy and that there was a clear mental and moral difference between him and a person like Spiesel. When Spiesel got up on the stand and said that he'd seen Shaw and Ferry agree to murder Kennedy and that federal agents had hypnotised him 50 or 60 times against his will, he said these things because he was so disturbed that he really believed them. Spiesel had a serious mental illness, and we have to feel quite sorry for him for that reason. But Garrison, on the other hand, always had at least some element of calculation and cynicism in his choices. He wasn't totally confused about the difference between fact and fiction. He did at some level know the difference between them, and yet he always decided to choose fiction, except on the rare occasions when it suited him better to go with fact. Speisel was so far gone that he didn't know any better, but Garrison was not that far gone. Garrison did know better, and yet he kept doing terrible things anyway. He knew, for example, that Charles Speisel was not sane, and yet he decided to let him testify against Shaw anyway because he thought it unlikely that the move would blow up in his face. And when it did blow up in his face, he blamed it on the same loyal deputy who he'd forced against his will to prosecute the innocent man. It's not like the Speisel episode was an isolated incident either. Speisel was just the most striking example of a problem that ran through all of Garrison's witnesses. The problem they had in common was that they were all testifying to something that wasn't true, and it was nobody's fault but Jim Garrison's that this was happening. When you set out to prove a bogus story in a courtroom, it's not going to be an accident that all the witnesses you find to support that story are all going to be flawed people in one way or another. There are many different ways of not telling the truth, and Garrison's rogues gallery of witnesses ran the gamut. They came from all different points on the bullshit spectrum. Some of them were honestly mistaken. Some of them were garden variety liars and grifters. There was a drug addict who wanted to get his parole violation reversed. There were witnesses who had been coerced and threatened. And up at the fully delusional end of the spectrum, there was the unfortunate Charles Speisel. Conspiracy theorists in general are like this too. They too come from all points on the spectrum of error. Some of them, in fact I would say most of them, are honestly mistaken. Some of them have been misled by shady operators. Some of them are shady operators themselves. And some of them are, unfortunately, as certifiably mad as poor old Charles Speisel. Another Garrison witness who blew up in the prosecution's face was a New Orleans postman named James Hardiman. Back in 1966, Clay Shaw had left New Orleans to go on a brief vacation, and while he was away, he'd had his mail redirected to the home of a friend. James Hardiman was the postman who had delivered Shaw's redirected mail to the friend's house, and Hardiman testified that during that period he had delivered several redirected letters to the friend's house that were addressed not to Clay Shaw, but to Clem Bertrand. But when Irvin Diamond cross-examined Hardiman, he caught him out with a classic lawyer's trick. He asked him if he also remembered delivering letters to Shaw's friend that were addressed to a man named Cliff Boudreau. Hardiman said yes, he did remember that. Unfortunately for Hardiman, Diamond had just made up the name Cliff Boudreau to trick him. There was, in fact, no such person. Diamond said, "Now, Mr. Hardiman, if I told you that I had just made that name up, would your testimony be the same?" And Hardiman replied, "Maybe you made it up, but I have delivered Boudreau mail there too." James Hardiman's reason for lying on the stand for Garrison was fairly straightforward. 9 months earlier, his son had been arrested for theft in New Orleans. Garrison's office hadn't yet brought charges against Hardiman's son, and naturally Hardiman didn't want them to, and naturally they decided not to after Hardiman had testified at the trial. By the time Hardiman testified, Clay Shaw's trial had been going for a week. The prosecution had spent that first week of the trial focusing on the New Orleans side of the case. They'd done their best to show that Clay Shaw had often hung around with David Ferry and Lee Oswald in New Orleans, and that he'd been in the habit of using the alias Clay or Clem Bertrand. But at the end of the trial's first week, the prosecution case took a sudden pivot. Suddenly, their focus shifted from New Orleans to Dallas. More specifically, it shifted to Dealey Plaza and the events that had occurred there at 12:30 in the afternoon on November the 22nd, 1963. Several large props were brought into the courtroom to flag this change of emphasis. including a scale model of Dealey Plaza. Irvin Diamond objected to this move from the prosecution. He said that what had happened in Dealey Plaza was, quote, irrelevant as to what happened here. Diamond feared that he could see what was about to happen. People had long suspected that what Jim Garrison really wanted to do in this case was put the Warren report on trial. And now the prosecution was clearly about to start doing that. It was about to do its best to whip up the jury's general sense of confusion and unease about what had happened in Dealey Plaza, in the hope that the jury would then take out its sense of unease on Clay Shaw. But Irvin Diamond's objection was overruled, and the prosecution was allowed to go ahead and present its Dealey Plaza material. Again, the movie JFK gives you the impression that Garrison himself handled this part of the trial. You probably remember scenes of Kevin Costner gravely talking the jury through the frames of the Zapruder film and masterfully dismantling the single bullet theory. But in real life, the Dallas evidence was presented by two of Garrison's deputies, although Garrison did put in one of his rare personal appearances in the courtroom when the model of Dealey Plaza was brought in. This was only his third appearance in the courtroom to date, and after staying for only around 30 minutes, he again found that he had something more important to do somewhere else. To get the Dallas phase of its case underway, the first witness the state called was Abraham Zapruder. A film projector was brought into the courtroom, and Zapruder's silent 26-second home movie of the assassination was played to the jury 4 times that afternoon. Before the trial was over, the film would end up being shown in court a total of 13 times. It isn't hard to see why Garrison's team wanted the jury to see the Zapruder film as many times as possible, and why Shaw's lawyers kept objecting in vain that the film was irrelevant. In 1969, the Zapruder film was still a rare and fabled piece of evidence. It had never before been shown in public. Still images from it had been published in Life magazine, and bootleg copies of the film had been shown on various university campuses, but otherwise the film had been kept tightly under wraps. The film wasn't shown on American TV until 1975, when Geraldo Rivera made a big deal out of playing a grainy bootleg copy of it on his show Goodnight America. So when the film was shown to the Shaw jury on the afternoon of February the 13th, 1969, they were seeing it for the first ever time in their lives, and its impact on them was bound to be quite visceral. Garrison himself believed that his subpoenaing of the Zapruder film was going to be the central masterstroke of his case. He told one reporter that when the film was shown in court, it might cause a revolution. They might even make me vice president, he said. For Garrison, as for many conspiracy theorists, the most incendiary part of the Zapruder film came at the end, when Kennedy's head and body can clearly be seen to lurch violently backwards after the fatal headshot. Back and to the left, as Kevin Costner puts it in JFK. To a layperson, the backwards snap of Kennedy's body does certainly make it look as if he was shot from in front, from the area of the grassy knoll. As I explained back in episode 9, though, the famous backwards head snap doesn't really mean what it appears to mean. For one thing, when a body gets hit by a bullet, the body doesn't really go violently flying off in the same direction the bullet is heading in. That's a Hollywood myth. More to the point, the post-mortem examination of Kennedy's body clearly showed that his head had been only struck by one bullet, and that this bullet had come in at the back of his skull and had blown out a gaping exit wound on the side and front of the skull. Many different panels of medical experts have reviewed the autopsy evidence over the years, and every single one of them has confirmed the original verdict. Both the shots that hit Kennedy, including the fatal headshot, came from behind, not from in front. Indeed, the Zapruder film itself confirms this point in 2 different ways. when you watch the film at normal speed, you can see that at the same moment when Kennedy's body starts to snap backwards, a horrible jet of blood and brain matter and bone comes flying out the front of Kennedy's head in a forwards direction. And when you slow the film down and watch it frame by frame, you can see that Kennedy's head suddenly and briefly jolts forward by approximately 2.3 inches straight after the bullet hits it and just before his body begins to lurch dramatically backwards. So whatever it was that caused his body to lurch backwards after the headshot, the evidence clearly shows that the lurch was not caused by a shot hitting him from in front. And in fact, we do know what did cause the backwards lurch. As I explained in episode 9, Oswald's headshot from behind destroyed the president's brain and nervous system, which sent all kinds of rogue signals through his body. This caused all the muscles in his body to suddenly tighten, and because the back muscles are stronger than the stomach muscles, his body lurched backwards instead of forwards. In 1969, though, no expert had ever explained to the American public how a shot from behind could have caused Kennedy's body to lurch backwards, for the simple reason that the American public didn't know that his body had lurched backwards because they'd never seen the Zapruder film. So when the Shaw jury saw the film for the first time that afternoon in court, they would have been well within their rights to believe that it offered clear visual evidence that Kennedy had been shot from in front and that at least one of Jim Garrison's main claims was true. The film did seem to suggest that there had been a second gunman on the knoll and therefore a conspiracy. But even if the Zapruder film did prove that there had been a conspiracy, and it didn't, but even if it did, it still proved exactly nothing about Clay Shaw's involvement in that conspiracy. Even if there was a second gunman on the knoll, not even Garrison had been wacky enough to suggest that that second gunman was Clay Shaw. Shaw had been in San Francisco on the day of the assassination, and Garrison didn't dispute that, although he did claim that the reason Shaw had gone to San Francisco was to establish an alibi for the assassination. Still, to the untrained eye, the Zapruder film did suggest that there had been some kind of conspiracy and some kind of cover-up. And since Clay Shaw was the man who was currently on trial, it was possible that the jury would decide to use him as a whipping boy for any doubts or suspicions that the film aroused in them. The afternoon when the Zapruder film was first played in court was, according to one of Shaw's attorneys, the defence's darkest hour in the whole trial. After Abraham Zapruder left the stand, the state called several other Dealey Plaza witnesses. One of them was a guy named William Newman, who had been watching the president's motorcade go by from the curb at the bottom of the grassy knoll when the shots were fired. Newman testified that the fatal headshot, in his opinion, had been fired from somewhere behind him, from the parking lot at the top of the knoll. A witness named Mary Mormon was then called to testify about a famous photograph that she'd taken in Dealey Plaza that afternoon. This photograph is known as the Mormon photograph, and it was taken about 1/6 of a second after Kennedy was shot in the head. It shows Kennedy slumped forward in the limousine, and you can see the knoll in the background. And according to some conspiracy theorists, including Jim Garrison, when you blow up the Mormon photograph, you can see some very blurred human figures standing behind the picket fence at the top of the knoll. One of these figures is a guy who is known in the assassination literature as Badge Man, because he appears to be wearing a dark shirt with some kind of badge on it. In the opinion of people like Garrison, Badge Man appears to be holding a rifle, and that rifle appears to be emitting a blast of light. Years later, a computer animation expert named Dale Myers mapped the Mormon photograph onto a 3D computer model of Dealey Plaza, and he found that the shape that some people had taken for a man wearing a badge was in fact far too small to have been a man, and was almost certainly the distorted image of a Coke bottle sitting on a concrete wall. If the shape was a man, he would have to have been standing 32 feet behind the picket fence and levitating 4.5 feet off the ground. Another witness the state called during this second phase of its case was Wesley Frazier, the neighbour of Ruth Payne's, who had driven Oswald to work on the morning of the assassination. When Oswald got in Frazier's car that morning, he was carrying a long, heavy-looking object wrapped in brown paper, and when Frazier asked him what was in the package, Oswald told him that it contained some curtain rods. That was obviously a hilarious lie. Clearly the package had contained Oswald's rifle. Conspiracy theorists like Sylvia Maher had twisted themselves into all kinds of knots, trying to deny that simple fact. But Jim Garrison, for once, was ready to obey the laws of common sense on this point. He was ready to accept that the long, rifle-shaped object that Oswald took to work that morning was indeed a rifle. In fact, it needed to have been a rifle from Garrison's point of view, because Oswald carrying a rifle into the building was one of the 5 overt acts that Garrison said had occurred in the furtherance of the Shaw conspiracy. After spending a week on the Dealey Plaza evidence, Garrison's team did seem to have done a fairly good job of suggesting that Kennedy had been shot from both the depository and the knoll, and that a conspiracy had therefore taken place. The knoll evidence wasn't nearly as good as it seemed to be, but you can see how a jury might have been impressed by it. But the prosecution still somehow had to weld the two halves of its case together. They had to somehow demonstrate that there was some kind of link between the grassy knoll evidence and Clay Shaw. For a whole week now, the prosecution had barely mentioned Shaw's name at all. So to finish their case off, they did somehow have to circle back to Shaw and remind the jury that he was the man on trial and he was the man that they were supposed to find guilty at the end of it. So when the prosecution was done presenting its Dealey Plaza evidence, it made a final attempt to swing the spotlight back onto Clay Shaw. As their final witness, they called a New Orleans cop named Aloysius J. Habighorst. Or anyway, they tried to call Habighorst. The defence objected, and the judge sent the jury out of the courtroom so that he could decide whether or not to admit Habighorst's testimony. The evidentiary hearing about the Habighorst evidence wound up lasting for a full day. Although the jury was absent from the room, the press and the public were allowed to stay. Witnesses for both sides took to the stand during this mini-hearing, including Aloysius J. Habighorst himself. Habighorst's story was that he had fingerprinted Clay Shaw on the night of his arrest. He claimed to have asked Shaw if he'd ever used any aliases, and Shaw had replied that yes, he had sometimes used the alias Clay Bertrand. So Habighorst had typed the name Clay Bertrand into the alias section on Shaw's fingerprint card, and Shaw had then signed the card. This signed fingerprint card did still exist, and it did have Clay Shaw's real fingerprints on it and his real signature, and the name Clay Bertrand had indeed been typed into the alias section. Clay Shaw didn't deny that the signature on the card was his, but according to him, the card had been blank when he signed it, and Habighorst had told him that he had to sign the card if he wanted to post bail. If that was true, then the obvious implication was that Habighorst, or possibly somebody else, had typed the alias Clay Shaw onto the card after Shaw had signed it. Naturally, Jim Garrison was keen for the jury to see the signed fingerprint card and to call Habighorst as the state's final witness, because if his story was true, it would have been a pretty explosive note for the state's case to end on. The problem with Habighorst's evidence, though, was that Garrison, in typical style, had let Habighorst go on TV and tell his story 6 months before the trial, and this move had violated a court order that forbade Garrison's office from disclosing any of the evidence against Shaw before the trial began. shortly after Habekost appeared on TV, a leaked photograph of the signed fingerprint card had been published in a New Orleans newspaper, again in violation of the court order. This is why the defence had objected to Habekost appearing as a witness, and it's why the Judge Haggerty, had called the evidentiary hearing to decide the issue. The mini-hearing did not go well for Jim Garrison. 3 other New Orleans cops who'd been present on the night of Shaw's arrest testified that they had not heard Shaw say anything about using any aliases. One of these cops was a sergeant who had been assigned to guard Shaw that night and who had been standing within a few feet of him at all times, including when he was fingerprinted. The sergeant had heard the entire conversation between Habekost and Shaw, and he testified that at no point had Habekost asked Shaw any questions about using an alias. All this was enough for Judge Haggerty, who ruled that he was not going to admit the fingerprint card into evidence. As he delivered this ruling, he said, "So even if Officer Habekost is telling the truth, and I doubt it very seriously," James Alcock interrupted the judge at this point. He leapt to his feet and objected and said, "Are you passing on the credibility of the state's witnesses in front of the press and the world?" And Judge Haggerty replied, "The jury is not hearing it. That is the main thing. The whole world can hear it. I do not believe Officer Habekost. I do not believe him." With that embarrassing statement ringing in the world's ear, the prosecution was done. It didn't have any more witnesses to call. Its case had been a mishmash of lies and quarter truths and irrelevancies, and now its case had ended with a story so transparently bogus that it hadn't even been admitted into evidence. When the jury came back into the courtroom, James Alcock stood up and said, "The state rests." Many observers were apparently stunned when Alcock said this, because even after everything that had gone before, many people were still clinging to the belief that Jim Garrison had something on Shaw, and that at the climactic moment of the trial, he would pull the ace from his sleeve or the rabbit from his hat. But it was finally clear now that there were not going to be any rabbits or aces. It was all done. The prosecution had rested. For many who had believed in Garrison, as Patricia Lambert puts it in her book, reality began seeping in. But there was a lot more reality still to come. The defence hadn't presented its case yet, and we'll be talking about the defence's case next time in what really will be our final episode about the Garrison case on the Ghosts of Dallas.